President of the United States, Donald Trump, set his deadline for ending the war in Ukraine to August 8th at the United Nations Security Council. And not without reason. American diplomat John Kelly stated at the United Nations Security Council meeting that the United States president intends to achieve an end to Russia's war against Ukraine by August 8th. Otherwise, the Kremlin will face serious consequences. And many people are now skeptical even about such a step from Washington because there is only 1 week left. But some experts believe that by bringing the issue to the United Nations Security Council, the United States wants to publicly secure China's position on Russia's war against Ukraine. They say if Beijing is really calling for an end to the war, then now is the time to confirm it on the international stage. If China once again avoids pressuring Russia to make peace, this will give Washington complete freedom to impose punitive sanctions against Moscow's partners at the United Nations level. I'm Pechy. Today is July 31st. Let's solve this together. But before we begin, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechy News. The link is in the description of this video. So, American diplomat John Kelly publicly stated today at a United Nations Security Council meeting that the United States president intends to achieve an end to Russia's war against Ukraine by August 8th. Quote, Russia and Ukraine must agree to a ceasefire and a lasting peace. It's time to reach an agreement. President Trump has made it clear that this must be done by August 8th. Otherwise, the United States is prepared to take additional measures to achieve peace in Ukraine. And this last phrase is very important in the context of China, oddly enough. The thing is, China always publicly states that it supports a political and diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine. At the same time, Beijing always opposes so-called unilateral sanctions. Beijing's logic always comes down to the idea that issues of sanctions should be resolved exclusively at the international level and must be authorized by the United Nations Security Council. They say the West cannot punish any countries on its own. For example, take Iran and the nuclear agreement. Sanctions were initially imposed against Iran precisely at the level of the United Nations Security Council, and that was an international decision, not unilateral sanctions. The United States is now taking an intriguing step by bringing their decision to the United Nations Security Council. This move is effectively an invitation for China to participate in dialogue. The permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are the United States, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and France. 5 countries. Plus, there are 10 more non-permanent members, but all decisions are based on these 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Obviously, Russia and China always oppose international sanctions against Russia, even those sanctioned by the United Nations, thereby blocking any decision. Now the United States is bringing this issue of sanctions to the United Nations platform. And the logic is as follows, as I see it. The United States, Britain, and France support ending Russia's war against Ukraine and accordingly are ready to punish the Kremlin for continuing its aggression with unilateral sanctions. China also seems to support a political and diplomatic settlement. Accordingly, it's time to prove this in practice, and not unilaterally, but on the platform of the United Nations Security Council. It is assumed that China will avoid supporting Trump's plan to make peace in Ukraine until August 8. This finally reveals China's real intentions. Crucially, it demonstrates China's position as Russia's partner and ally. You might say, listen, that's already obvious. Everyone has long understood perfectly well that China is a partner and ally of Russia, and you're right. But the United States of America needs a solid pretext to impose secondary sanctions, secondary ones. Portland is against China because it supports the aggressor and refuses to seek peace together at the United Nations level. This publicly makes him an accomplice. Well, the idea is not to force China to support the United States' plan, but to expose and solidify Beijing's position for the sake of further arguments for so-called unilateral sanctions. Let me remind you that the day before, the United States and China agreed to continue discussing the terms of extending the tariff truce, but the final decision will be made by United States President Donald Trump. This truce in the trade war ends on August 12th. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent earlier stated that the issue of secondary tariffs against China for its purchase of Russian oil is one of the key topics of the recent talks in Stockholm. Let me remind you, the day before, two delegations held talks in Stockholm for 2 days, and China stated that it is not ready to give up Russian oil even under the threat of a 100% tariff. Trump has decided to solidify his position now through the United Nations Security Council. Whether this will work or not is still an open question, but Washington is clearly preparing such a perfectly clean ground for introducing these tariffs. Remember, on July 29th, Trump gave Moscow 10 days to end the war, expiring around August 8th. Earlier, on July 14th, Trump mentioned another 50-day time frame. However, later he toughened his position, citing deep disappointment with the actions of Vladimir Putin, who, despite United States diplomatic efforts, continues to escalate the war and strike peaceful Ukrainian cities. And if the demands are not met, Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs against Russia, but even more importantly, against countries that continue to trade with it. In response, the press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Peskov, stated that Russia does not intend to cease hostilities despite pressure from the United States. According to him, Moscow's actions in Ukraine are a defense of national interests, and the Russian economy has supposedly developed an immunity to Western sanctions. The dictator, Putin, has not made any public statements yet in response to the American ultimatum. However, his ally, Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia and former President of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, got into a spat with Donald Trump and Senator Lindsey Graham on social media. And so Medvedev, in particular, threatened the United States with a nuclear apocalypse. In response, the head of the White House warned him against such remarks, stating that he was treading on extremely dangerous ground. Let me remind you that Medvedev stated that all of Trump's ultimatums only bring war between Russia and the United States closer. Trump responded to this, quote, "Russia and the United States have almost no business together. Okay, let's keep it that way." And tell Medvedev, the failed ex-president of Russia, who still thinks he's president, to watch his words because he's treading on very dangerous ground. Medvedev, in response, called the United States president's reaction nervous and said that if that's the case, then Russia is right about everything and will continue on its own path. And then he started making remarks saying that Trump should remember the story of the Walking Dead and the so-called dead hand. But it's funny that Medvedev wrote his first threats to Trump for some reason on a social network, and even in the enemy's English language, and most likely from an American iPhone. And Trump saw all this and responded, yeah. After getting pushback, Medvedev snapped back already on Telegram and in Russian. But for some reason, Medvedev went silent on the social network. And just for understanding, dead hand is a colloquial name for the system. The Perimeter is a semi-automated nuclear strike control system complex created during the Soviet Union era, which ensures a retaliatory nuclear strike in case command centers or communication lines are destroyed. Well, that's why it's time for China to stop dodging and publicly admit whose side it's on. And, as it seems to me, that's exactly what the United States is pushing Beijing to do right now. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Bye, everyone. Subtitles created by